There is a place deep beneath Rome, a forbidden space that no one is allowed to enter without special permission. This is not a place where history is openly displayed, but a place where history is carefully hidden, sealed in the deepest chambers behind 3 layers of heavy iron doors between walls that seem to echo no sound. There, the Vatican has kept millions of pages of documents for more than 12 centuries, not to be revealed but to wait. Can you imagine letters handwritten by popes that were never sent, bans on books that changed the world, accounts of Marian apparitions that were quietly rejected or whispered, exchanges between the Vatican and emperors, fascists and Western intelligence? All of it is there, along with works of art that the world has never seen. Why does the Vatican keep all of this and never say anything? This is not a story of mysterious conspiracies or macabre theories. Rather, it is a story of the deepest memories buried in the world of faith, a journey to discover what is destined to remain hidden. The narrator, a former caretaker or custode in Italian, is not a powerful cardinal, nor a famous historian, nor a descendant of nobility. He is just an ordinary caretaker whose main job is to clean take notes and deliver approved documents to scholars. But there are nights when the old priest has fallen asleep, and the oil lamp burns dimly in the corner of the room. He stealthily opens doors that no one else dares to approach. From that moment on, a path of no return is opened. He knew his time was short. In these last years of his life, his heart beat slower. His eyes grew dim in the candlelight, and his hands began to tremble as he touched the old parchment that had once been as familiar as his own skin. But before it all died with him, he had to speak, not to shock or to accuse or to forgive, but just so that someone out there might understand. Because the truth never belonged entirely to the light, nor to the dark. It dwelled in the space between patiently waiting to be heard. Continuing the story of the secrets hidden deep under Rome, the narrator begins to reveal the first things he witnessed on his journey, living evidence that is not in history books, but exists in the silence of the archives. He remembers clearly what he experienced. It was a letter from Pope Pius X, lying quietly in an unmarked drawer. A letter perhaps carrying thoughts and concerns that were never sent, never reached the recipient. He also read the banned copies of books, were once considered a direct threat to the foundations of faith works, whose existence even as copies was enough to stir the deepest layers of the Church. And most haunting of all, perhaps, was when he stood before the Caravaggio's painting, have never been exhibited publicly. Why? Because, as he felt the eyes in those portraits, looked straight into a kind of pain that theology did not dare to face, a naked, all-too-human truth that dry dogma could hardly explain. From those observations, a profound personal conclusion gradually formed in his mind. What is not allowed to be revealed is not because it is wrong, but because it is too right to accept. The truth sometimes is a heavier burden than any lie. He does not ask you to believe what he says because he cannot provide concrete evidence that the world will accept. Instead, this is a call to those who are still listening, still reading, and still believing that under every glorious halo there is still something deeper, something unresolved, unexposed. It was these experiences that completely changed his perception of the Vatican. He had once seen it as a purely religious symbol, a place where popes in white robes prayed outdoors in St. Peter's Square. But that was only the surface, the outer shell. Behind ancient stone walls, beneath towering domes and hidden behind doors locked by 3 complex mechanisms, was a world that most of humanity will never be allowed to see. That is the world of the Vatican Secret Archives, where secrets are carefully kept waiting to be revealed, even if only in whispers. Now that we've uncovered some of the initial experiences, let's dig deeper into where those secrets lie. Vatican Secret Archives. People often call it the Secret Archive, but the official name is in Latin. Vatican Secret Apostolic Archive has a different and deeper meaning. From secret in Latin does not mean secret in our modern sense, but actually means private. This suggests that the archive belongs to the Pope personally, not to the entire Catholic Church. This private nature has inadvertently made it the subject of countless theories, from political investigations to hunts for lost legends. Imagine how big a space it is. The archive spans about 5 kilometers of bookshelves, more contained 5,000 items catalogued, covering events from the 8th century to the present day. Yet only a fraction of them are accessible to scholars. Documents deemed most sensitive or unpublished remain sealed deep in the inner vaults, and it is there that some of the most important and controversial moments in European and Christian history are carefully preserved. Only 60 to 80 scholars are allowed to study on-site each year. They must submit an application stating their research topic and abide by extremely strict rules. No photographs, no copies, and no documents are allowed to leave the room. Most importantly, no one is allowed unrestricted access. The most sensitive areas remain sealed, keeping whispers of the past hidden. One of the most famous examples of the intersection of science and faith preserved here is a copy of the letter that Galileo to the Church in 1613. In the letter, he attempted to argue that his views on astronomy were not in conflict with the Bible. Yet just 3 years later, in 1616, the Church declared heliocentrism heretical and banned its teaching. By 1633, Galileo was on trial at the Inquisition, and the proceedings of that court are also deeply documented in this very archive, a reminder of historical confrontations. Another collection, once the most sought after, involves the trial of the Knights Templar in the 14th century. For hundreds of years, it was believed that the Vatican had destroyed all records of the trial. But in 2001, an Italian scholar named Barbara Frail made a shocking discovery. She found a copy of Chinon parchment, a document revealing that Pope Clement V had secretly pardoned the Knights Templar. The discovery completely contradicts the long-held belief that the Church had agreed to their extermination. It raises a haunting question: why was the truth hidden for more than 700 years? The answer probably lies somewhere between the complexities of power and deep calculations. And then we have the documents about the Vatican's sensitive relationship with dictatorships in the 20th century, especially Nazi Germany. The archives contain hundreds of letters exchanged between the Vatican and the Hitler regime, along with reports sent to the Holy See by German bishops. These documents make clear that the Vatican knew in advance about the mass murder of Jews. However, their response was extremely complicated, shaped by faith, political calculations, and fear of persecution. It was not until 2020, after decades of controversy, that the Vatican finally opened part of its archives related to Pope Pius XII, who led the Church from 1939 to 1958, which coincided with the years of World War II. It was a groundbreaking moment for historians, as the Pope had long been accused of remaining silent during the Holocaust. The newly released documents reveal a more complex picture. He was not entirely silent, but rather chose to act quietly behind the scenes to save lives, a strategy that remains deeply controversial in its morality and effectiveness. But the archives are not limited to religious or political matters. They also house handwritten letters from Michelangelo's sketches of Bernini, a touching farewell letter from Mary, Queen of Scots, before her execution, and even a letter from a Native American chief to the Pope in the 19th century. The Vatican archives, like a portal, connect the entire flow of history, from the bloodshed of the Crusades to the scientific revolution, from theological schisms to modern political intrigue. It is a priceless treasure trove, where the past lies dormant, waiting for those patient and brave enough to listen to its story. As we grow accustomed to the silence of the archives, a deeper layer of mystery begins to open up, revealing the deep cracks in the heart of Christian history, the story of schisms, and the brutality of the Inquisition. Few know that from the very early days of Protestant Reformation, one of the greatest events that divided the Church there were many secret exchange between Martin Luther and the Vatican. The narrator witnesses handwritten notes from that period that bring a Dutch scholar to tears, not because of religious disagreement, but because these documents reveal a heartbreaking truth both sides tried to prevent the split. But in the end, they were caught in the vortex of pride and power without being able to find common ground. In the 1530s, the Vatican quietly sent envoys to the German duchies to negotiate with the reformers. Among the documents were statements by Bishop Girolamo Aleandro. A theologian and diplomat proposed rare theological concessions to preserve church unity. But when Luther's response, cautious but firm, came to heal, history has since followed an irreversible path, creating a split that has lasted for centuries. These precious documents, testament to a missed opportunity, remain in a sealed archive, accessible only to those with advanced degrees and a legitimate purpose. Another subject which once made the narrator shudder was the record of Vatican Inquisition. It still holds thousands of indictments, interrogation records, and even death sentences for people accused of heresy from the 12th to the 19th centuries. One of the most notorious cases is that of Giordano Bruno, a philosopher-astrologer and proponent of the theory of an infinite universe. The documents about Bruno reveal not only his sharp intellectual arguments, but also his inner conflict of the very clergy who were to judge him. In an internal note, one cleric wrote, "If we let him go, the doctrine will waver, but if we burn him alive, history will never forgive us." And Bruno was eventually executed in 1600 at Campo de' Fiori. The centuries-long silence about the case remains one of the clearest reflections of the lingering tensions between faith and knowledge, a never-ending struggle in the human heart. Away from the scars of schisms and heresy condemnations, the Vatican archives open another chapter, revealing the Holy See's complex interactions with secular empires, especially during major historical upheavals. For example, when Napoleon Bonaparte, invading Italy, he ordered the Vatican's most valuable documents to be transferred to Paris. Tens of thousands of items were carefully packed, sealed, and taken across the Alps. Sadly, many of them were never returned, and what the Vatican recovered after Napoleon's defeat remains classified to this day. The narrator once saw a handwritten note from Pope Pius VI. Describes the sense of the Church's loss of soul as the ancient texts were loaded onto French wagons. The document was written in charcoal, with a small, meticulous line at the bottom of the page, containing just one sentence: "We have been stripped." That sentence, full of meaning, encapsulated the pain and helplessness of a spiritual power in the face of military might. One of the most surprising revelations comes from diplomatic correspondence between the Vatican and Asian countries. Few people know that in the 17th century, the Vatican secretly exchanged letters with Tokugawa shogunate of Japan, even though Christianity was banned there. These letters were sent through Portuguese missionaries, hidden in merchant ships, and even hidden inside small wooden statues to avoid detection. A letter from 1611, written by the Tokugawa Ieyasu. The Vatican ordered the letter to be written stating, "We do not accept a faith that divides families, but we respect the knowledge and loyalty that your missionaries bring." The Vatican carefully preserved that letter as a quiet monument to its first and also failed diplomatic contact with the closed Asian empire. Then, there is another lesser-known section of the archive, dedicated to theme maps and blueprints of lost churches, monasteries, fortresses, and catacombs. Among them are maps showing the locations of ancient dioceses that disappeared due to war plague or political upheaval. One thing that still haunts the narrator is the floor plan of Montsegur, the site of a massive siege and burning in 1244 during the crusade against the Cathars. On that map, there is a curious sign and escape route that does not appear in any official records. No one knows whether the Cathars ultimately escaped by that route, but the document has never been confirmed or denied. And like many of the secrets in this archive, it is a reminder that history is never a straightforward story. Deep in the most heavily guarded part of the archives, the narrator remembers a particular room where records are kept classified according to the political affiliations between the Vatican and global powers from the 19th century to the present. The boxes are neatly arranged by country, each a piece of memory, a piece of truth untouched by the official narrative. Most people know that the Vatican became an independent nation in 1929 after Lateran Treaty between Pope Pius XI and Benito Mussolini. But few people really understand that before that, from 1870, when the Kingdom of Italy annexed the Papal States, the Vatican lived in a state of near isolation for nearly 60 years. It was a borderless state existing within Rome. During that time, the popes refused to recognize the Italian government and never stepped outside the walls of the Vatican. And it was during this tense period that the Church quietly built up a complex network of secret communications with other countries, especially France, Austria, Spain, and the United States. A document from 1922 reveals that the Vatican once sent a secret message to President of the United States, Warren G. Harding, offering to mediate between the United States and the divided Catholic states of Europe after World War I. The event has never appeared in official history books, as the Vatican did not have the legal status of a state at the time. However, the memorandum survives with its signature and seal intact. When the narrator first touches it, the paper is brittle, the corners darkened with age, but the contents are alive, as if history itself were whispering in his ear. Period. World War II. Brought a trove of extremely sensitive documents. Dozens of reports sent from local bishops to the Vatican clearly document the mass murder of Jews in Poland, Germany, and even France. One report, dated 1942, was sent from Krakow by Cardinal Adam Sapieharot, later a spiritual advisor to Pope John Paul II. "If we do not speak out, we will be guilty of complicity before God," he wrote, but even such urgent silence is gratifying. Why did the Vatican delay condemning the genocide? Scholars have long debated whether it was a strategy to protect the Church and its followers in occupied territories. But a document the narrator reads handwritten by a member of the Papal Council reveals a deeper complexity. It warns of the risk of losing control over believers if faith is drawn into the vortex of political ideology. In other words, the Vatican fears that taking sides could fracture the global Church itself. That silence lasted until the 1960s, when the Vatican began one of the most important reforms in modern Church history. Vatican II Council. The records from that council form one of the largest and most complex parts of the archive. Thousands of pages of theological debates, political reactions, transcripts of episcopal speeches, and analyses of the shifting authority of the Church in a rapidly changing world. The narrator once read the transcript of a debate between two senior cardinals over whether to allow the use of the vernacular instead of Latin at Mass. One said, "If we give up Latin, we give up the symbol of eternity." The other replied, "If we don't change, we give up the people." The council was not just about language, but marked the Vatican's first real opening to dialogue with Jews, Buddhists, Muslims, and even atheists. The archive still holds an unpublished manuscript of a speech in which Pope Paul VI intended to issue a formal apology for the Vatican's silence during the Holocaust. In the end, the speech was replaced with a more neutral version. No one knows exactly why, but a handwritten note in the margin in Latin remains Tempest non demest. the time has not come yet. As the narrator flips through the files, he never sees the kind of global conspiracy that wild theories often suggest. What he sees is a constant struggle between faith and politics, between morality and survival. The Vatican Archives do not lie. They wait for someone patient and brave enough to read them to understand and accept that history is never black or white, but always gray. There is one section of the archive that always weighs on the narrator's mind: the records relating to the Vatican's relations with colonial empires, especially during the period from the 15th to the 19th centuries. The faded pages inside the old boxes contain no direct accusations, no official statements advocating war or deprivation of liberty. Yet between the carefully written lines, a quiet truth is revealed. Faith once moved with the sword of European colonialism as it spread across the world. In 1493, just 1 year after Christopher Columbus set foot in the New World, Pope Alexander VI issued a papal bull, among other things. In this decree, he divided the non-Christian world into two spheres of influence, one for Spain and one for Portugal, as if the Church had the authority to distribute global territory. The document remains in the Vatican Archives, housed in a thick binder labeled Decree, concerning the New World, written in official Latin, with the crimson seal of the Holy See. When the narrator holds it in his hands, he feels a chill run down his spine, for this is the moment that marked the faith, politicized to its extreme. Accompanying that decree were letters exchanged between the Vatican and the kings of Portugal, Spain, and later France and Belgium, in which the Pope asked for guarantees for the spread of the faith and protection for missionaries in newly conquered lands. But the reality on the ground was often bloodshed cultural erasure and cries for help from protesting clergy. Their voices are preserved in few documents, but are present like rays of light in the deep darkness. One such voice is that of Mr. Bartolomé de las Casas, who wrote to Pope Paul III in 1507. In his letter, he describes the mass executions of natives in Caribbean churches, the construction of buildings on blood-stained ground, and the silence of religious authorities in the face of atrocities. The letter reads oppressively, not as a prayer, but as a cry for help, not just for the victims, but for the conscience of the Church itself. Also, preserved in the archives, is the manuscript of the Apostolic Brief Most High God issued by Pope Paul III in 1537, in which he declared that the indigenous people of the Americas were truly human beings, with souls and a right to receive the gospel, and that they should not be enslaved. It was a progressive document at the time, but sadly its adoption was quickly revoked under pressure from European monarchs who refused to give up the economic benefits of slavery. As the 19th century progressed, the Vatican's diplomatic role in protecting religious interests in its African and Asian colonies became increasingly evident in archives relating to India. The narrator once read through a thick file detailing the presence of French missionaries in Vietnam before the French invasion. There were letters sent to Rome describing the pressures faced by Catholic converts under the Nguyen dynasty. But interwoven into these reports were phrases such as opportunities for expanding influence and a role as intermediary with Western merchant lines, suggesting faith and secular power have begun to merge in ways that are difficult to separate. It is important to note that the Vatican never directly ordered colonial conquest, but through its seals of approval, official blessings, and the moral legitimacy it extended, one can trace the Church's role in validating empires and assuaging the consciences of those it conquered. But the Vatican archives also contain many records that reveal internal dissent. Many priests, monks, and bishops protested against the colonial use of religion. One 1885 document tells of a French bishop in the Congo who filed a formal protest with the Vatican after witnessing hundreds of people having their hands amputated for failing to meet rubber quotas for King Leopold II's company. The Vatican's response is recorded in a single short line. We pray for them, but intercession is beyond our reach. Perhaps that is why the Vatican archives are not just a repository of memories, but also a mirror. The fine line between faith and politics, between justice and power. As the narrator looks at the cracked red wax seals, the signatures of popes, cardinals, kings, and merchants, he is reminded that history is never linear, and that the Vatican, for all its sanctity, has been a participant in decisions that have reshaped the course of human civilization. If you thought the Vatican's role in politics ended in the Middle Ages or after World War II, you might be surprised to learn that the archives continued to record important moments of history well into the second half of the 20th century. One of the most secure areas of the Vatican archives houses diplomatic records of the Holy See's engagements with global powers during the Cold War, especially in Eastern Europe, Latin America, and the Soviet Union. The narrator remembers very clearly the first time he came across a thick set of documents about Balanin, the 1970s, a period when the Solidarity movement began to emerge as a symbol of anti-communist resistance. Many people know that Pope John Paul II, the first Polish pope, was a strong supporter of the movement, but few people realized that the Vatican, through secret channels, sent money, printing equipment, and even intelligence to these opposition groups. These actions are clearly documented in internal reports. A memo sent from the Vatican Secretariat of State to the Apostolic Nuncio in Warsaw contains a handwritten note from Cardinal Casseroli. This is not just a defense of the faith. This is a moment of survival. These documents reveal that the Vatican is not just a passive observer, but a sophisticated political actor using soft power to effect major changes in the global order. Poland is not the only focus. The Vatican has also been deeply involved. Latin America. In a confidential file relating to Argentina in the years 1976 to 1983 during the violent Dirty War, the narrator stumbles upon disturbing reports appeals from local bishops' lists of kidnapped priests and conflicting responses from the Vatican. A telegram from Buenos Aires mentions Father Carlos Mujica, who was assassinated for advocating for the poor and opposing military violence. But the Vatican's response simply states, "We cannot publicly take sides in an internal conflict." That sentence haunts the narrator for a long time, not because it is completely false, but because it reflects the Vatican's traditional strategy of acting quietly, remaining neutral in public while privately supporting what it believes is a just side. In Chile, during the rule of Augusto Pinochet, the archives reveal periods of silence and moments of indirect pressure. A fully recorded private meeting between Cardinal Angelo Sodano and Chilean military leaders includes a message expressing concern that the Church was being seen as a haven for enemies of the regime. At the same time, the records confirm that the Vatican protected priests sheltering political fugitives, not through public decrees, but through internal memos, demanding the reinstatement of deposed bishops sympathetic to the opposition. The Cold War also brought complex dynamics to the Vatican's relationship with Soviet Union. Although Catholicism was severely repressed in Soviet territories, the Vatican maintained separate channels of communication. A typewritten report dated March 12, 1962, details a secret meeting between an unofficial Vatican emissary and a representative of the Khrushchev government in Vienna. The conversation was not tense. They discussed religious freedom and the safety of clergy. But the fact that the meeting took place sent a clear message that the Vatican was willing to negotiate if it could save lives and protect the faith. It is important to note that the Vatican has not always been on the side of justice, at least not in the way the outside world often hopes. In the case of Spain under Franco, the Vatican maintained diplomatic relations with the dictatorship for decades. Some scholars have called this a compromise with authoritarianism to protect the faithful. Letters preserved in the archives show that bishops may have disagreed, but ultimately followed orders from above. For a long time, the narrator had thought that the Vatican archives would be filled with mystical secrets, ancient scriptures, and lost relics. But after years of research, he came to understand this. The most shocking discoveries are not those that are beyond history, but truths too real, too political, too close to what surrounds us today. Truths that many would rather not face. The Vatican is not a supernatural power, but a religious political entity that operates with strategy, logic, and careful calculation. And its archives are not stained glass windows or holy statues, but the place where this complex reality is exposed in its most honest form. Of all the rooms the narrator has entered inside the Vatican archives, none has left him as silent as the one marked P12, Pest. Though that name is synonymous with Pope Pius XII, who reigned from 1939 to 1958, a period that almost perfectly coincided with World War II. He remains at the center of one of the most enduring debates in modern history. Did the Vatican do enough, say enough, or stay silent for too long in the face of the 20th century's most brutal genocide? For decades, the records of Pope Pius XII remained sealed deeply, dividing historians around the world. Some called him the Pope of Silence, while others defended him as a cautious diplomat, forced into silence to protect lives that public speech could never save. When in 2020, the Vatican officially declassified a portion of the documents from his pontificate, a wave of amazement swept across the academic world. The narrator was one of the few people present at the archives when the documents were first opened. He remembers clearly the first time he opened the file, which was simply titled censored, the bishop's activities during the conflict. Inside are letters, reports, and telegrams, many from bishops in Germany, Poland, and Hungary, sent between 1941 and 1944. A letter from the Archbishop of Lviv, dated March 16, 1942, describes how more than 1,000 Jewish residents were expelled from the town without formal charges or any convictions. At the end of the letter, he begs the Vatican to intervene, or at least speak out. The Vatican's response, attached shortly afterward, consists of just a few short lines. We share in the pain, but prayer is the most powerful weapon we have at this time. It was not a refusal to help, but it was clearly not enough to stop what was happening. There is a separate, thick folder titled Richieste di aiuto ailo, Request for Help and Asylum. Inside were hundreds of individual appeals from Jews, priests, scholars, and even artists writing directly to the Holy See for protection. Some were helped into hiding in convents, helped by nuns, or given forged documents identifying themselves as Catholics to avoid German detection. But others received no response. One page in particular stunned the narrator. A handwritten list of 44 names each with an address, religion, age, and a note kept in the convent of Santa Brigida. The document was dated October 10, 1943, just 3 days after the Germans began clearing out Jews in Rome. Of the 44 listed cross-referenced records showed that only 12 had survived. And then there is a little-known detail, something that can only be seen by those who have read these pages for themselves between 1942 and 1944. The Vatican sent several memos to the German embassy in Rome, asking for an easing of repression in areas where Catholic Jews lived. These letters were never made public. They do not contain strong language, do not use the word crime, do not mention genocide. Instead, they speak diplomatically, expressing concern for social stability, the need to protect the sacred right to life. Perhaps it was the only viable language left at the time, but for future generations that caution remains a source of sadness and debate. The archive also holds an entire chapter on post-war appeals from the Jewish community. In 1945, a delegation representing a European jury wrote to the Holy See, asking for confirmation that Catholic institutions had sheltered Jewish children during the war, and for the children to be returned to their surviving relatives. The Vatican responded, "We will only allow it if the children freely choose to leave their current environment." But many of these children were only 5 or 6 years old at the time, most of whom remembered nothing beyond the convent walls and the faith in which they had recently been baptized. That moral wound would remain open for years. Among the thousands of pages, the narrator comes across a manuscript of a speech that was never delivered, prepared for Easter 1943. It contains a line that reads, "We cannot close our eyes to the cry of a displaced people, who, although they do not bear the name of Christ, are still human beings." That sentence was never published. The final version of the speech was revised, and that passage was deleted. No explanation is given. Only a red stamp remains, "Reservato nonare," reserve not published. What the narrator has seen does not give him the right to draw conclusions. He has not been in their shoes. He does not carry the weight of a global organization in wartime. But he understands why many people call the Vatican Archives a place of deferred truths, not because those truths are lost, but because no one is willing to face them until later. People often think of the Vatican as a purely Western institution, tied to Europe and the history of Christianity on the old continent. But documents buried deep in the archives reveal something different. From the earliest days, the Vatican had a vision beyond its borders looking eastward. It is in these yellowing pages that the narrator first understands the true scale of the Church's missionary ambitions, its efforts at dialogue, and the profound and often conflictual encounters between Catholicism and Asia. Part of the archive titled Missions of the East. Oriental Missions contains thousands of documents dating from the 16th to the 20th centuries, written in Latin, Italian, French, Classical Chinese, and Japanese. These texts record centuries of European missionaries traveling east, bringing not only the Bible, but also the values of a completely different world. The narrator begins with a file simply named China, Letters of the Jesuits, Letters from the Society of Jesus in China. This is a collection of letters sent to the Vatican from China by Jesuit priests between 1580 and 1773. Among them are the works of Matthew Ricci, the first Westerner to enter the Forbidden City. In his letters, Ricci expressed admiration for the Confucian ethical system and suggested that the Vatican adapt Catholic teachings to Chinese culture rather than impose them. However, not everyone agreed. The archives document decades of fierce debate within the Vatican over whether Chinese converts should be allowed to continue ancestral worship alongside their Catholic faith. Ultimately, Pope Clement IX issued an edict banning what were known as Chinese rites. This decision severely damaged relations with the Qing dynasty, and by 1721 missionary activity in China was banned altogether. Another file, classified as top secret, contains documents about relations between the Vatican and Japan. In it, there was a letter written in Chinese characters by Tokugawa Ieyasu in 1610, was translated and preserved with astonishing directness. Your religion disrupts internal order. It divides father and son, master and servant. I will not allow it. What follows is a long series of tragic reports. The mass execution of Catholics in Nagasaki, priests burned alive, churches destroyed. But from these fragments, the narrator reads a remarkable resilience handwritten letters from imprisoned Japanese believers sent to the Vatican via Portuguese merchant ships written in blood on rags. There is no mysticism, no drama, just people who believe in something greater than themselves and who pay the ultimate price for that belief. The narrator then enters another world, documents relating to Vietnam. The flow here has its own distinct identity, caught between East and West, between faith and sovereignty, between mission and politics. A file from 1790 preserved a letter from Bishop Pinot de Béhainesand to the Vatican, reporting on his efforts to help Prince Nguyen An. Later, Emperor Jia Long rebuild his forces and regain his throne. The letter was not just a missionary report, but living proof that Catholicism played a role in shaping modern Vietnam, not just as a foreign religion, but as an agent in nation building. But the archives also record darker chapters: the Nguyen dynasty's anti-Christian edicts, the executions of believers, the desperate pleas of missionaries. One document from 1833 recounts the rebellion of Le Van Khoi, noted for some support from Catholic communities and a cautious response from the Vatican. We must not let the faith become entangled in rebellion. That line reflects the quiet tension between the desire to protect the faithful and the fear of being drawn into uncontrollable local conflicts. During the 20th century, the relationship between the Vatican and Vietnam became increasingly complex. A dossier covering the period from 1954 to 1975 is dense with reports on Catholic life in the North, the mass migration to the South, and the influence of the Saigon government in episcopal appointments. A letter from Pope Pius XII. The letter to President Ngo Dinh Diem was a blessing, but carried a subtle message. A national leader has the duty not only to protect the faith, but also to ensure justice for all his subjects. It is one of the few documents written in a tone that is both supportive and warning. What perhaps most unnerves the narrator is a particular file that chronicles the failed efforts to restore diplomatic relations between the Vatican and the Socialist Republic of Vietnam after 1975. Internal notes reveal the Vatican's patience, its repeated offers of dialogue, and its hope to re-establish a humanitarian channel. But every meeting ends in formal politeness. A 1989 memo reads, "We must wait. Patience is part of the duty." Even in the silent pages, the narrator can feel the weight of history. Each letter, each red seal, is more than just an administrative document. It is a trace of a long and difficult interaction between civilizations. The Vatican has not always been right or fully understanding about the East, but the presence of thousands of documents about Asia at the heart of the Vatican is evidence of something deeper. This has never been a separate world. It has always been a living, enduring part of global history. The narrator had thought of the Vatican as a perfect unity, an organizational pyramid with no room for internal dissent. But it was only when he delved deeper into the archives that he began to understand that the Vatican was also a living entity, rife with disputes, contradictions, and sometimes silent struggles among the men in white robes. A section of the archives is marked as sub secretos pontificio, under the papal secret, contained records of individual confrontations between popes and cardinals, or between former popes and their successors. These documents were never made public while the individuals involved were still alive. They were archived only after the events had passed into history, or after the individuals involved had left office. A special collection of records reveals the tension between Pope Paul VI and Cardinal Giuseppe Siri. Siri was once considered a leading candidate for the papacy at the Second Vatican Council, and he was fiercely opposed to the modernization of the Church, from replacing Latin with vernacular languages in the Mass to engaging in dialogue with other religions. Internal records show that he wrote privately to Pope Paul VI, denouncing what he saw as the destruction of the sacred. The Pope's reply was just 2 lines long, but unmistakably chilling. The shepherd cannot wait for the hesitation of the gatekeeper. The disagreements were not limited to theology. The Vatican also suffered deep cracks in its financial management. One of the most scandalous and well-documented episodes in the archives was Vatican Bank crisis related to Institute of Religious Works IOR in the late 1970s and early 1980s. The narrator still remembers holding a typewritten document of nearly 600 pages titled Calvi Case, Calvi Case. It refers to the case of Roberto Calvi, an Italian banker found hanged under London's Blackfriars Bridge in 1982. The press dubbed him God's banker because of his close ties to the Vatican Bank. His death was officially declared a suicide, but documents held in the Vatican archives tell a different story. Inside were bank statements, letters between the IOR and Banco Ambrosiano records of suspicious loans and lists of accounts held by front companies in Panama. A handwritten memo from a bishop raised grave concerns. "We are using sacred property for dangerous activities bordering on sin," but the warnings were ignored. The files also document internal efforts to redact records to thwart a legitimate investigation by the Italian authorities. At least 3 documents were labeled destroyed for unknown reasons, but they were never destroyed. Equally sensitive is the dossier on the scandal. Vatileaks in connection with leaked Vatican documents. Many people still remember the name Paul Gabriel Personal Butler, Pope Benedict XVI, who copied and leaked many confidential files from the archives. A dedicated box holds the entire timeline of the affair from the internal investigation to Gabriele's handwritten confession, in which he wrote, "I did not betray the Holy Father. I just wanted the Church to know what was going on behind closed doors." The leaked documents revealed deep internal divisions within factions in Rome, rival interest groups, and power struggles for influence. Many of the papers exposed financial favoritism, corruption in church appointments, and efforts to suppress scandals involving ethics and criminal behavior. Each line was a crack in public trust. The fact that the Vatican chose to prosecute Gabriele in a public trial was a rare sign that the wall of silence was beginning to crack. When a priest in charge of the archives once asked, "Why does the Vatican keep documents that could damage its own reputation?" he smiled and replied with a line the narrator never forgot, "Because the truth does not belong to us, it only passes through us." The Vatican archives do not attempt to erase the past. They preserve it, sometimes in silence, sometimes in sorrow, as an act of implicit responsibility. And more than any statue of a saint, this is what makes the place so profoundly human, a space where power, faith, and failure are recorded in ink, not water. Here's a little-known fact. Not every meeting between a head of state and the Pope is announced to the outside world. The press reports only a few photos of handshakes and a general diplomatic statement about mutual understanding, cooperation, and peace. But in the Vatican archives, the narrator finds handwritten notes of what was actually said behind closed doors. The exchanges are sometimes frank, sometimes emotional, sometimes contentious, and always carefully written in ink, designed to last for centuries. One of the most prominent records is the record of the meeting between Pope Pius XI and the Nazi ambassador to the Holy See Diego of Bergen in 1939. This event took place shortly after Hitler had invaded Czechoslovakia, and tensions with Poland were rising. In the internal memo, the Pope did not directly condemn it, but rather asked pointedly, "Does your government still have control over the hatred it has sown in German society?" The ambassador did not respond directly. The file ends with the remark, "The atmosphere became noticeably colder," without a closing prayer. A small detail, but one that speaks volumes about the stalemate and the underlying tension. Back in the 60s, the narrator stumbles upon records of a 1965 meeting between Pope Paulus and Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko. In public, the meeting was hailed as a historic effort to reopen dialogue between East and West. But in the archived minutes, the scribe noted, "The Soviet delegation stated that religion is an instrument of distorting historical truth." Paul VI replied gently but firmly, "No one can forbid others to believe in the divine. It is not a force, but a part of the human soul." Then, without further comment, he invited the entire delegation to stand in silence for a minute to remember all the unknown souls who died for their ideals. The Soviet side never mentioned this gesture in any of their official records. Another notable dossier is simply titled USA Visit Reservation, Unpublished Visits to the United States. Inside are notes from private meetings between various popes and U.S. presidents from Roosevelt and Eisenhower to Kennedy, Reagan, and George W. Bush. One entry records a moment during a meeting between Pope John XXIII with President John F. Kennedy, 1963. President Kennedy expressed deep concern about the risk of nuclear conflict after the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Pope asked, "Who will remain calm before the world has no moral foundation to stand on?" Curiously, neither man had much time left. After that meeting, Pope John died just a few months later, and Kennedy was assassinated later that year. The file does not directly relate to that, but the proximity of the events led some in the archives to mark it as particularly sensitive. It's not just global superpowers that are represented in these records. The narrator once found an old faded file about a meeting between Pope John Paul VI and Secretary General Mikhail Gorbachev in 1989, just before the fall of the Berlin Wall. Gorbachev was not a religious man, but in the minutes of the meeting he said, "If we do not change, there will be nothing left to preserve." John Paul II responded with a single line, "Truth rises when people are tired." After that conversation, the Vatican became one of the first institutions to predict the disintegration of the Eastern Bloc. Some of the most surprising documents come from smaller countries, or countries that do not have long-standing diplomatic relations with the Vatican. In a file marked as Vietnam Informal Workshop, the narrator finds an internal memo from 1991. An unofficial Vatican delegation had been holding talks with representatives of the Vietnamese government in Geneva. There was no formal agreement, but there was an expression of goodwill. It was one of the first quiet steps toward restoring communication after 1975, not through newspaper headlines, but through handwritten words recorded in silence. The Vatican has no military power and no vast economy. But what the narrator understands after reading these files is that when a world leader seeks honesty or advice unburdened by political interests, they turn to the Holy See. And the Vatican knows this. They rarely need to speak out because each page they hold has the power to reshape the understanding of an entire generation if revealed in time. One of the things that sets the Vatican apart from every other religious organization in the world is that it is not just a church, but a sovereign state. They can sign treaties, issue diplomatic communications, and even be sued. And in one of the least discussed parts of the Vatican archives, Legal Causes, Legal Cases, the narrator encounters a very different side of the Holy See. In these pages, the language is no longer that of prayer, but that of legal argument. Few would expect the Vatican a holy place to be taken to court, but in fact, since the early 20th century, there have been hundreds of legal disputes involving the Vatican both internally and with foreign governments. A thick document details the famous legal conflict between the Vatican and the Italian government after the signing of the Lateran Treaty in 1929. The issue was not just about borders or privileges, but also about ownership of hundreds of buildings, churches, and monasteries across Italy. One memorandum stated, "We cannot allow sacred land to become negotiable property, but we cannot allow it to be nationalized without conditions." Negotiations dragged on for years, at times threatening to spiral into a diplomatic crisis. The Vatican had to prove its legal ownership of medieval property, often using original documents taken from these same archives, written in Latin, and signed by popes as far back as the 12th century. As a result, many Catholic properties remain legal to this day. But perhaps the most painful and deeply disturbing documents are those relating to cases of sexual abuse in the Church, which broke out publicly globally in the early 2000s. Stored in a sensitive directory marked as reserved disciplinary cases. Secret disciplinary cases. The narrator read documents that no seminary had ever taught him to expect. One file detailed an internal investigation from 1962 in a North American diocese. The victim was a minor, the perpetrator, a priest who had been reported multiple times. But the memo contained clear instructions from above Transfer this individual to another parish. Do not make the matter public. Avoid scandalizing the community. No warnings were given to the next congregation, and years later, the same offense occurred. This was not an isolated case. Similar files emerged from Ireland, Germany, Argentina, the Philippines, some of which were never reported in the media. Letters from victims reached the Vatican, sometimes handwritten, in a shaky hand. I don't know who else will listen. Please don't pretend nothing happened. Some received no response. Other letters were marked for internal review. The Vatican has never denied that abuse occurred, but it has approached the issue as an institutional crisis, not simply a matter of individual crimes. Since 2001, the Holy See has implemented more stringent disciplinary procedures, and many records document that gradual change. But what silences the story is the agonizing slowness of change. In a 2010 report, one bishop admitted, "We were so afraid of scandal that we forgot who we were supposed to protect." In addition to abuses, the Vatican has faced numerous international lawsuits over disputed assets, particularly after World War II. A 1997 file documents a lawsuit filed by descendants of Jewish families alleging that the Church held valuable gold items looted by the Nazis. The Vatican denies liability, but the file remains in the archives as unresolved claims. Another highly sensitive case involves the Vatican museums, which hold tens of thousands of artifacts from around the world, including items originating from countries that were once under colonial rule. In a petition from Peru, the government requested the return of an Inca ceremonial mask. The Vatican responded with an official statement that the artifact is a historical record. It has no ownership value, but belongs to the memory of humanity. That issue remains unresolved like many others. The archive never presents conclusions. It merely preserves evidence. But as you read through the hundreds of legal briefs, lawsuits, and carefully worded responses, you come to understand that the Vatican is not cut off from the world. It is drawn into it layer by layer by the very nature of man and his inheritance even in his white robes. The paper records remain impersonal but undeniable. There is a part of the Vatican archives that even many Catholic scholars have never had access to, not because it is the most closely guarded, but because it requires a very special kind of knowledge, a mastery of the Greek, Hebrew, and Latin of the early Church. It is informally known as the First Manuscript Room, a room that holds the foundational texts of the Christian faith. Ancient Bibles, the earliest translations, and even written works that were excluded from the formation of the Bible we know today. Entering that section for the first time, the narrator barely dares to breathe, not out of fear, but out of a sense of reverence. As he stands among millennia of handwritten letters engraved on animal parchment, with ink made from ash roots, and the tears of people who believed their words to be of divine origin. Tucked away inside an old wooden drawer is a replica of Codex Vaticanus, one of the oldest surviving Greek Bibles dating from the 4th century. Its text is not identical to the printed Bible we know today. Some passages are missing. Others are worded differently, and notably, there are entire sections of narrative that no longer appear in the modern canon. A notable example is the ending of the Gospel of Mark. Modern versions usually end with Jesus appearing to his disciples after his resurrection, but in the Codex Vaticanus that ending is absent. The text ends abruptly with the words, "and they were afraid." This has long been the subject of scholarly debate. Is the widely known ending a later version? And the Codex was not alone. In a small metal cabinet with 3 locks, the narrator once found a folder labeled Apocryphal Gospels. The Apocryphal Gospels. These are the Gospels that were excluded from the official Bible, among them the Gospel of Thomas, Mary Magdalene, and Philip. These were rediscovered in Nag Hammadi, Egypt in 1945, although the Vatican had copies long before that. For example, the Gospel of Thomas contains 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, but arranged without narrative structure. One saying reads, "The kingdom of God is within you and all around you." If these words were indeed from Christ, they raise profound theological questions about the necessity of the Church as an intermediary between humanity and the divine. Perhaps for this reason such texts have never been canonized. Even more controversial are the Pilate's action. This document presents the alleged defense of the Roman governor after ordering the crucifixion of Jesus. In it, Pilate describes Christ as a man unlike any who had ever lived, whose eyes were like fire, and whose words flowed like living water. The mythical tone of the story may explain why it was omitted from the official New Testament, but its presence suggests that even Roman officials once tried to make sense of the crucifixion in their own words. In addition to ancient texts, the archive holds numerous letters exchanged between medieval popes and great theologians. Letters that record heated debates about whether certain books, such as the Apocalypse of Enoch, Book of Wisdom, or Maccabees, should it be included in the Bible. In a letter of Pope Damasus II, he wrote, "We do not reject them because of lies, but because the human heart is not yet ready." That sentence haunted the narrator, causing him to wonder how much of the Bible is divine truth and how much is the result of decisions made under historical pressure. Another file details a closed session of Council of Nicaea in 325, the first major meeting of Christian bishops from across the Roman Empire to formalize doctrine. The minutes include a list of the texts discussed, many of which have not survived. A marginal note from a Greek scribe reads, "Certain works will be retained for further theological study, and not for public reading." This suggests that they were not only destroyed, but also retained, and may still be in locked drawers like the one in front of the narrator. The archive does not declare anything right or wrong. It remains silent, preserving every interpretation, every variation, every crack in the history of the faith. Some might find that offensive, but the narrator does not. He believes that what makes faith resilient is not perfect uniformity, but the ability to survive debate, revision, and even doubt. To the outside world, the Pope is a symbol of stability, the successor of St. Peter, the embodiment of continuity and unshakable Catholic faith. But in the Vatican archives, behind private files, secret letters, and unpublished notes lie something few dared to imagine popes are human too. They fear, they doubt, and sometimes they collapse under the weight of events beyond their control. The narrator still remembers the first time he saw a folder titled Unsent Letters. The unsent letters. Inside were handwritten manuscripts from various popes never printed and never answered. These were not diplomatic letters or official decrees. They read more like diary entries in which men at the height of their spiritual power wrote down the things they could not say in words. One of the most haunting letters was from Pope Benedict XV, written in 1917, at the height of World War I. The letter was addressed to European leaders pleading for a ceasefire, lest humanity be completely lost to the thunder of artillery. But the letter was never sent. A note in the margin, written by the Cardinal Secretary of State at the time, read, "No one will listen, and if they do not listen, your holiness will grow weak." The letter was folded and put on a shelf forgotten, until the narrator stumbles upon it more than a century later. Another file is marked as "Reserved for each conclave." Reserved for each conclave. Contains documents written by several popes for their successors. These documents are never made public, but are intended only for the College of Cardinals to read during the papal election. One such 12-page memorandum was Pope Pius XI. Written in 1950. Just as the Nazis were consolidating power, and anti-Semitic laws were spreading, the Pope expressed deep concern that parts of the German Church had begun to secretly collaborate with the Nazi regime. If we remain silent, he warned, history will not speak of our wisdom, but of our complicity. The document was never read publicly. Pius XI died shortly before he could issue a public encyclical condemning anti-Semitism. The memorandum remains in the archives sealed and silent. A file that made the narrator stand still for a long time was the file about Pope John Paul V, who served for just 33 days before his sudden death. Many conspiracy theories have swirled around that event, but in the archives there is no appeal, only the cold facts of internal memos showing that the Pope had been preparing a comprehensive reform of Vatican financial management, including changes to the Vatican Bank and a review of secret accounts linked to Italian financial institutions. In one of his handwritten notes he wrote, "The Church cannot preach purity if it is not transparent itself." The sentence was underlined 3 times, but he never had a chance to act. And in a meeting, minutes kept shortly after his death, a cardinal wrote, "We must continue the mission, but we must not touch the structural foundations." That sentence has echoed in the narrator's mind ever since. Even beloved popes like John Paul II and Francis also left behind emotional handwritten letters. An unpublished manuscript by John Paul II, written at the height of the abuse scandal, reveals a clear inner conflict. "I don't know if I have done enough. Every night I pray not only for God's forgiveness, but also for the victim I have never met." His handwriting is simple, but his words are heavy, like the papal tiara he wore for more than 2 decades. Pope Francis, known for his closeness and reformist spirit, also left letters that have never been made public. One was sent to a cardinal convicted of abuse, in which he wrote, "The sins of one individual do not destroy the Church, but their cover-up does." An attached memo reveals that fierce internal debate continues within the Vatican about the boundaries of forgiveness and transparency in the modern age. The Vatican archives never speak, but the yellowed, trembling, never seen by the public pages carry what no press release can convey: that beneath the glitter of power, Peter's throne was also a lonely journey, and that even the head of the Church had sleepless nights like any other soul in the world. When the narrator ends his journey through the silent corridors of the Vatican archives, he is not only filled with new knowledge, but also with a profound sense of connection to history. He began this journey believing that he would find earth-shattering secrets, hidden conspiracies. But what he actually finds is much deeper. It is humanity of an organization that has existed for millennia, with all its glories and failures, its great decisions and its painful mistakes. He realized that the archive was not a repository of lies, but a place of truth. Truth delayed, not because those truths were lost, but because no one was willing to face them until later. It is a complex truth, not black and white with no clear heroes or villains, but only people, whether in papal or priestly robes, grappling with the burdens of power, faith, and existence. When he left those rooms, he carried a message with him. History is never a simple story. It is an intricate tapestry woven with threads of power, faith, politics, and humanity. The Vatican archives, with all their silence, are a living testimony to that. They are not just a collection of old papers, but a reminder that the past still whispers to us, waiting to be heard, understood, and accepted. And in those whispers, we can find not only the secrets of the Vatican, but also profound lessons for our own future. When the narrator ends his journey through the silent corridors of the Vatican archives, he is not only filled with new knowledge, but also with a profound sense of connection to history. He began this journey believing that he would find earth-shattering secrets, hidden conspiracies. But what he actually finds is much deeper. It is humanity of an organization that has existed for millennia, with all its glories and failures, its great decisions and its painful mistakes. He realized that the archive was not a repository of lies, but a place of truth. Truth delayed. Not because those truths were lost, but because no one was willing to face them until later. It is a complex truth, not black and white with no clear heroes or villains, but only people, whether in papal or priestly robes, grappling with the burdens of power, faith, and existence. When he left those rooms, he carried a message with him. History is never a simple story. It is an intricate tapestry, woven with threads of power, faith, politics, and humanity. The Vatican Archives, with all their silence, are a living testimony to that. They are not just a collection of old papers, but a reminder that the past still whispers to us, waiting to be heard, understood, and accepted. And in those whispers, we can find not only the secrets of the Vatican, but also profound lessons for our own future. When people think of the Vatican, they often think of the sacred rituals and high beliefs of the Church. But few think of the telegrams, intelligence reports, or complex financial deals with foreign banks. Yet, it is precisely these seemingly mundane elements that make up a significant portion of the deepest layers of the Vatican Archives, where the Holy See's informal relationships with worldly powers are recorded line by line. One of the first directories that astounds the narrator is titled Intelligence Contact Reservate, Secret Intelligence Liaison. It contains detailed documents about secret communications between the Vatican and Western intelligence agencies during the Cold War, especially with the CIA and MI6. In a memo dated June 17, 1953, just weeks after the coup in Iran, a CIA representative in Rome met with the Vatican cardinal to discuss anti-communist developments in the Middle East. The brief report reads, "The Holy See is morally supportive, will not intervene directly, but is willing to encourage local churches to promote democratic values in opposition to atheism." No formal agreement was ever signed, but the message was clear. The Vatican not only observed the world, but also had the moral authority to influence the flow of ideologies, especially through faith. Another memo from 1979 records a secret meeting between a CIA officer and Vatican officials just before Pope John Paul II's visit to his native Poland. The CIA expressed particular interest in whether the Polish Pope could inspire the Solidarity movement. The Vatican made no promises, but the memo noted, "We are aware of our role, but the gospel is not a strategic tool." It was a diplomatic response that neither agreed nor denied, but left room for silence. Another file titled Relation Reservate Israel, Secret Israeli Relations, documents secret contacts between the Vatican and Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency. The correspondence includes Vatican requests for protection of Christian holy sites in Jerusalem amid escalating tensions between Jews and Palestinians. A Mossad report sent back to the Vatican stated, "We do not care about the religion of the person standing in the holy place as long as they do not hide weapons." The Vatican's response was yes, but say we do not hide weapons, we preserve the memory. The next layer the narrator encounters has nothing to do with espionage, but with finance. A folder called Banker is Power, Banks and Power documents the Vatican's relationships with a number of international financial institutions, including Banco Ambrosiano Switzerland's UBS and financial institutions in Panama. The files contain records of wire transfers and investments in real estate across London, Paris, and even resorts in South America. An internal report from 1985 notes, a portion of the investment profits will be directed to the Holy See's charitable funds without any public disclosure. The concern is not that the Vatican is investing, but that it is using shell companies to avoid scrutiny. Some accounts are listed under the names of pastoral organizations, but are managed by financial executives at private banks. There is no evidence of abuse, but the structure is so opaque that tracing the money is nearly impossible, and perhaps that is precisely the intention. What surprised the narrator even more was a small document unnumbered, unstamped, with only a handwritten title. Rapporti Fraternita Reserve, informal fraternal report. These are records of secret meetings between senior Vatican officials and representatives of Western secret societies, including the Freemasons, a group not condemned by the Catholic Church. A memo, dated 1969, records a bishop in Switzerland meeting with a senior member of the European Freemasons to explore the possibility of dialogue on human rights and freedom of conscience. It does not draw any conclusions, but it is notable that Vatican policy began to shift from an outright ban to a more cautious stance, discouraging participation, creating a doctrinal gray area, and allowing interfaith dialogue with groups once considered heretical. The narrator finds no evidence of conspiracy or manipulation of world events by the Vatican, but he sees clearly that the Vatican does not live in isolation, but maintains a network that is not declared, not made public, but has been operating silently for centuries. Its archives are not lies. They wait for someone patient and brave enough to read, to understand and accept that history is never black or white, but always gray. When the narrator ends his journey through the silent corridors of the Vatican archives, he is not only filled with new knowledge, but also with a profound sense of connection to history. He began this journey believing that he would find earth-shattering secrets, hidden conspiracies. But what he actually finds is much deeper. Humanity of an organization that has existed for millennia, with all its glories and failures, its great decisions and its painful mistakes. He realized that the archive was not a repository of lies, but a place of truth. Truth delayed. Not because those truths were lost, but because no one was willing to face them until later. It is a complex truth, not black and white with no clear heroes or villains, but only people, whether in papal or priestly robes, grappling with the burdens of power, faith, and existence. When he left those rooms, he carried a message with him. History is never a simple story. It is an intricate tapestry woven with threads of power, faith, politics, and humanity. The Vatican archives, with all their silence, are a living testimony to that. They are not just a collection of old papers, but a reminder that the past still whispers to us, waiting to be heard, understood, and accepted. And in those whispers we can find not only the secrets of the Vatican, but also profound lessons for our own future.